Welcome to the Ruthless Criticism Podcast. Today is Saturday, June 9th, 2018. And to be honest, it's been a little bit of time since the previous podcast. And it's probably going to be longer spans of time between upcoming podcasts as well. And the other thing I'm going to note is this podcast is probably going to be a little bit less edited than other podcasts, simply because time is just becoming a bit more of a constraint, primarily due to projects at work and just how much time I'm having to invest in other things outside of this podcast. That said, I did want to give a few thoughts on a subject that just recently actually came up and sort of triggered in my mind a few things. So again, expect more ums and uhs and stuff like that, and a few less jump cuts, although I tend to think that my jump cuts are not really that noticeable. It's quite easy with audio, I guess, but this one will be a little bit less processed, and I don't know, maybe it'll be easier to go to sleep to or something like that. So who knows, there might be some benefits coming out of this. And if you're not already asleep, we will then continue into the topic for today, which is basically the relation between wages and capital and how this plays out in terms of things like unemployment benefits, and for that matter, a rather hot button topic today, universal basic income. I want to take a quick moment just to establish the baseline of where I'm working from, which I believe is the correct interpretation as far as Marxian economics is concerned. In the capitalist system, essentially you have a complete dichotomy between wages and capital. Essentially, that which doesn't go to wages goes to capital, and that which goes to capital doesn't go to wages, as I think would be obvious. So the essential principle here, though, is then that wages are not simply the individual wage that a worker receives. Rather, it's viewed in a social context. So that is to say that of all the value that society is creating, of all the value that labor is producing in that society, if you minus the total aggregate capital or the total aggregate surplus, which is then can be reinvested into capital, the remainder of that is essentially the wages. And actually, that's probably not the right way to put it, because the wages do come from the standpoint of demand, right? So that is to say that workers do require a certain amount to be incentivized to even go to work. That is, wages are the value that is returned to the worker to reproduce them as a worker, and that includes the reproduction of the working class, as I think I've mentioned in previous videos. So when I talk about wages here, I'm not talking about your particular wage as a worker. Rather, I'm talking about this aggregate total value that gets returned to the working class outside of capital. And it's with that we can sort of delve into the topic of discussion that sort of spawned this podcast or inspired this podcast to happen this late and under these circumstances where I'm actually quite tired. But the question was posed on the Capitalism v. Socialism subreddit: do you think unemployment benefits effectively neutralize the wage slavery that exists under purer forms of capitalism? And I think there's a lot of problems with this question generally. I'm going to sort of whittle it down to the basic question that I want to get at, which is not so much whether or not unemployment benefits effectively neutralize wage slavery. Of course, that's not the case. In my response on Capitalism v. Socialism, I compared that to asking is whether or not giving a slave a week off negates slavery. Obviously, unemployment benefits cannot constitute the ability to sustain the working class as a whole indefinitely. That is to say that under no circumstance would this actually be capable of freeing the entire class from the system of wage slavery. And the unemployment benefits themselves, were they not to start eating into whatever liquid capital sort of exists, would necessarily have to be renewed and reproduced from other value production as well. However, that being said, what unemployment benefits do is, or rather unemployment benefits do constitute a component of wages, right? That is, it is one of these things that is returned to the working class. And again, when viewing this from the class perspective as opposed to the individual worker, it's plainly obvious to see how the unemployment benefits are, particularly in the United States, where there is a tax, although there is tax on the individual income, there is a tax levied against employers as well to help pay for those benefits. These were victories that were won in working class struggles and essentially constitute a class-wide raise in wages, right? And this pool of money that is returned to workers as a class as a means to essentially buffer or protect workers who are put in positions under the anarchy of capitalism, where crisis can hit, or even just a single company can go out of business, and a worker can find themselves without in a position of subsistence. These essentially constitute a wage return. And the point here is, though, that wage return has a limit. And although that wage return was won in a previous struggle from an organized working class fighting on behalf of its own class interests within the current system, it's not possible for the class to simply demand whatever they want and get it while maintaining capitalism, right? So they could clearly demand much more, but there are sort of hard limits to this with respect to the system itself. And inevitably, some surplus still has to be derived. So there's no way to return the total aggregate amount of value produced by the workers to the workers without reducing capital to zero, essentially. And what this inevitably means for something like UBI is quite similar, right? That there's a sort of hard limit as to how much value we can return to the working class as a whole without affecting essentially the current rate of surplus to such a degree that it causes problems for the system as a whole. Now, I don't have any particular data on this, and I don't really think that there's any real clear way to answer this completely, or to know for sure one way or the other whether or not this is possible. But it's my expectation that UBI on any large scale would essentially be unviable for the current capitalist system. And a good part of the reason that I think that is because, one, the previous crisis, which was quite hefty, as we all know, the 2008 Great Recession, as they call it, we've never fully recovered in terms of productivity levels. At least the last time I looked, we had still not recovered. That is to say, if you draw a sort of an average of the, if you basically make the gains in surplus a linear function, and you have sort of a straight line, so you average out all the rises and lowers, and I'm very tired. The peaks and valleys of the progress over time, and you just sort of get that average, and then you draw a straight line through the middle of that to where that averages out. You can get a linear graph, basically. So you can project that linear graph into the future. And of course, if you go 50 years into the future and the overall GDP growth, has been on the downturn for, let's say, 20 of those years, obviously that's going to affect what that slope looks like, right? So it's not going to be as steep a slope as it may have been if it was constantly going up. So it's not to say that the slope itself doesn't change with time. That's true as well. However, if you take that slope basically up until right before the recession and then just carry it through and project it, and you look at the GDP where it is today relative to where it was then, we still have not gotten back to that point of where we would have been had it kept growing. And that's the key distinction, I think, in terms of full recovery. And that's the position that generally most of the people that analyze recessions or crises in capitalism are concerned with. So this isn't to say that we haven't gotten to the same level of GDP that we were prior, even in real terms, or that we haven't made up the loss, so to speak. It's that we haven't made up the projected gains in the amount of time, or the type of gains that we should have projected based on equivalent past growth. And because of this, we are still in a state of crisis in Marxist terms, right? We have not restored essentially the full rate of profit equivalent to what it would have been had we not hit that recession. And this means essentially that the rate of profit is not going up. The rate of profit is essentially stagnating at maybe a little bit higher than what it was immediately following or immediately prior to the recession, but we have not actually recovered from that. And if we haven't recovered from that, then that does not bode well for any attempts to take another component or another chunk out of capital and push it towards the working class. Now, what a lot of people hear from this argument is going to be inevitably that I'm making a political argument that UBI is untenable. And of course, the thing is your politics should not follow your analysis of capitalism. They should follow your class interest. Right, so I'm not saying that we shouldn't fight for UBI or that UBI isn't a viable thing with which we can, work to organize movements with organic proletarian character. However, it is to say that I don't think this can actually be gained as a serious reform at this moment. I just don't think it's something that capitalism can concede at this point in history. This isn't to say that it won't be able to concede it at a future time. It isn't to say that, there aren't other factors that will go into increasing the rate of profit, not the least of which could be more thorough exploitation of the existing working class. But capitalism is in, I think, pretty serious trouble. And, historically, we've seen this cycle about every 10 years where we at least hit some sort of slowdown. It may not constitute a full-blown recession in anyone's terms. Certainly doesn't constitute a depression in most people's terminology. But we're going on 10 years and we haven't fully recovered. And this doesn't look good for what we would anticipate coming out of the next business cycle. And I'm not saying that means, we're going to be hitting the big one, so to speak. I'm just saying that right now, realistic gains within the context of capitalism are pretty slim. politically, it should be the goal of communists to consistently push and fight for all of those things which would benefit the working class. And when we talk about, or when most people talk about accelerationism, what most people are saying is that we should essentially concede to the capitalist arguments, that we should pick the worst of the worst or support the worst of the worst when it comes to capitalist exploitation and all the destruction that capitalism causes, and thereby make this world such a hell that people are ready to do essentially anything to overthrow the system, and that would somehow help us. And I think there's a few dangers in there. For one, I think that does not in itself, anger and this sort of revolutionary fervor does not in itself constitute necessarily a proletarian revolution. You can have other sort of social or political revolutions that are not necessarily demonstrating a proletarian character. That is, they're not necessarily revolutions that will ultimately work in the interests of the working class. And the biggest fear there, I think, is the complete degradation of capitalism towards a much more overt fascism. Now, arguably, we are not too far off from the sort of historical states of capitalism that have seen this. And I don't necessarily mean Trump. I know a lot of people will think that's what I'm getting at. But if you look around the world just in terms of how other leaders are playing out, I'm thinking particularly Modi in India, but also the sort of rise of nationalism in Ukraine. Certainly the way that Russia has continued to develop, obviously a lot of what's going on with respect to the Middle East, but also even down in Brazil in this, sort of terrible circumstances, Venezuela as well. The potential for capitalism to descend into barbarism in a much more overt way is too high to be messing around with this idea that we should just make things worse. It's too easy to play on people's nationalistic tendencies, their racial tendencies. There's still far too much social separation and alienation, which in most ways is only getting worse by the day. So it's a very dangerous game to play, that sort of accelerationism. And frankly, it's not the sort of accelerationism that helps, because for the most part, and by and large, the worse you make it for workers, that is, the more exploitation that you allow, the more gutting of social services and social safety nets like unemployment benefits, like pensions, etc. Generally, capitalism will thrive under those circumstances. And that means that capitalism could easily recover from this and then start to provide more concessions and start to sort of, the state can start to mediate those class interests again, because the system has sort of secured itself, or the system has raised up enough that it can secure itself. Only in very, very deep crises does that become essentially an impossibility. And then depending on the political factors, obviously, there are people with different interests in mind. That said, I think the type of accelerationism that we want is actually quite opposite. What we want to be doing is demanding the most always. Because the more that we demand for workers, in that sense, actually, the worse capitalism gets. Okay, and I don't mean the worse capitalism gets for the workers. Now, that may be true in certain contexts. That is to say, the more we demand for workers, the more we decrease that rate of profit, the more that downward trending rate in profit will actually affect capital investment, and then industries are likely to see crises hit, and that can obviously cause social problems and disruptions, at which point the immediate response is going to be by the state, we have to bail out XYZ company, or we have to start investing money in all this stuff and trying to basically take over the capitalist function in that area to save it, right? This is what we saw with the automobile industry in the recession. And when the state takes up that function, obviously this then can affect what they will say or what they're willing to concede at that point. And of course, it's going to turn into, well, we can't afford this, we can't afford that, and more cuts to the social services and safety nets. Again, whatever you put towards capital is in that dichotomous relationship with wages. So what this all turns out to basically be saying is that the more that we demand from capitalism as workers, and the more victories that we have from capitalism as workers, does two things. One, that actually does hasten the death of capitalism, right? By securing those demands, we are diminishing that which can go into the reproduction or the expansion of capital. And that is precisely what we want to be doing. Two, in organizing for those demands, that is where the organization of the proletariat as a class comes from. So these are the two most important factors that we can be doing. The answer is not to give capitalists everything that they want, because that will make the world worse. It will make the world worse, but it'll make the world worse in far less recoverable ways, right? It'll absolutely destroy our environment, perhaps beyond a point of return. So be very careful with accelerationism. Hopefully this podcast has clarified some things with respect to the relationship between wages and capital, and things like unemployment benefits or social services, and various social securities, as well as giving you some of my thoughts with respect to universal basic income, just in general, not viable in this time for capitalism, but that definitely means we should be demanding it, and we should be fighting for it. I think what we would probably see the most out of the system as it stands currently is something labeled UBI that is neither universal nor basic. So probably something sub-basic and something that is not universally applicable, which would, not be UBI in any real sense, but capitalism being the supreme marketing, I don't even know, but given that half of the shit you end up buying is essentially just sold to you under labels that appeal to you, I think UBI would very much end up in a similar position politically. And, we'd have Bernie Sanders out there touting UBI, and, it would be some bill that covers, or even if his version of the bill was legitimately UBI, by the time it actually got through, not that it would even remotely probably get through. We can't even do universal health care in this country. But let's say it did. I mean, it would just be gutted to hell. So, and that's another one that I'll bring up just real quick is, universal healthcare in the United States, I also think is another venue or another, vector in which we can, one, progress this struggle, but two, also get to that point of, again, diminishing capital, diminishing the power of capital, diminishing the reproduction of it. And by winning something like universal health care, we would, I think, certainly be in a much better position to then argue for something like UBI, or perhaps even be already organized for something like UBI. And this would just rapidly diminish the reproductive capacity of capital. I think the most extreme danger there at that point is then just, again, because of where we are post-recession, but also in a sense pre-recession or anticipating another downward turn probably within the next year or two, we would be again putting ourselves in a very dangerous situation, only because politically we'd have to have everything together. Politically, if you put universal health care followed by UBI in this country, and the economy crashed right after that, can you imagine politically how that would be used? I mean, man, you would see a complete overturning and gutting of everything, and some huge percent of workers, without the proper organizing in this country, would be the first to elect everyone who's going to gut it. It would just be used as a giant political football, and say this is what happens when you get a progressive agenda or something like that, or see, look, you tried to turn us into Venezuela and you crashed the economy, with no respect for the historical conditions that led to the fact that we hadn't recovered from the first recession, or that essentially that we were due for another downward turn within the same period of time. But of course, that's part of the game, and that's the political game. So, if you're going to take that path too, you got to be prepared, and you got to be politically prepared and politically organized, or else you definitely run some risks. It's a dangerous game. So that's about all I have to say on that. I hope this was interesting. I hope it's not too terrible without more editing. I'm sure it's pretty tired sounding. I'm very tired, so I'm going to wrap it up and get this uploaded and then head off to bed. So I bid you all a good night. And remember that if you like this podcast or you found it insightful in any way, leave a comment, thumbs up. And as always, make sure that you subscribe. Definitely comment. I'm looking for more comments.